just one
To
candidate?
just one candidate, yes.
All right, Mr. Baker. Irregardless of what this Do-Nothing Congress does with the DACA and TPS issue, how are you going to protect the sanctuary communities in Maryland that Sessions is threatening? And how are you going to protect the TPS and DACA citizens of Maryland?
Well, first of all, what we've done right away in Prince George's County is to issue a statement that we don't accept what Donald Trump came in, the philosophy came in under, that we're going to protect the people who are in Prince George's County and who reside there, whether they understand their immigration status or not. I think that's the first thing as governor. I want the state to make that same strong statement. It shouldn't just be Prince George's County or Montgomery County or individual places. It should be a statewide policy that we issue out, but also that we forcefully push back. And that's what we're not seeing from this government. We forcefully push back on the federal government and let them know where we stand, much like the Attorney General is doing. That's what I would do as governor.
Next question.
Hi, Ms. Krishanti. You being a lawyer, maybe I should. You being a lawyer, maybe I should ask you my question. Who decides the market, rental market? Oh, it's market price. Who decides it? I think it's all these rental buildings. Management decides and then throws it on our face. If you don't want to pay what we ask you to
Please
pay,
finish the question.
you can leave. Number 2 is planet warming and the heat.
I'm sorry, just one question, please.
The heat in my apartment beats down, just a second, beats down, and they don't turn on the AC and turn it off whenever they want to. Is there any law against that? Thank you.
It's just one question per candidate. Ms. Vignarajah?
I'm sorry.
No. And this is where I will say that I should have caveated with I went to Yale Law School where we didn't actually learn real law, so I may need to come back to you and get you an adequate answer. But I will say, and this is where, please let us talk afterwards, because I do think that this is a much bigger issue where, as governor, I think there's a few things that the executive branch can do, which haven't been kind of done as much as they could be. One is the fact that, in many states, there are legal clinics that ensure that people who come with landlord-tenant issues, when they believe that they've been priced out of markets, when they believe that there's been discrimination, that they can easily, kind of make a complaint and get that resolved in an expeditious fashion. Maryland has some parts of that, but the truth is that it hasn't been a user-friendly mechanism, so consumers like you can use it. And this is where there are a number of laws on the books that protect, not just in terms of the pricing, but also in terms of your question about heating. And that's where I think making sure that consumers are aware of that is an important part of the role of governor and the role of government.
New York is much better than Maryland.
Next question, please.
Next one, Mr. Ross. Good evening.
And could you just, if these are going to either take the microphone out or squat down just slightly so we can hear?
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Ross, if elected, will you push for legislation to guarantee all of Maryland's 2- and 4-year public college professors 2 things that they need, and these same 2 things all public employees in the state should have? And those 2 things are the unqualified right to engage in collective bargaining and the unqualified right to strike. Thank you.
So yes and yes. So I was speaking earlier today about a social contract. The relationship between government, state, and between government, capital, and labor. And in the last 30 years, the relationship between government, capital, and labor has substantially advantaged capital over labor. Collective bargaining is at the core of what enables labor to compete and succeed in today and tomorrow's world. And in the last 30 years, we have seen a consistent degradation of the power of labor, and we are seeing all of these laws which basically strip away collective bargaining rights. So the answer to both of your questions is yes and yes. It's American to be able to do collective bargaining. If you want to strike, absolutely. So this is big picture here. Like, there's a real problem in 2- and 4-year colleges here. But big picture is we need to recommit. We need to recommit to caring about the role of labor and not just commit to caring about balance sheets.
This is a question from Mr. Madaleno. My highest concern this election is climate change. And right now there are 2 exciting campaigns that give Maryland the opportunity to lead on climate action. The Clean Energy Jobs Initiative, which sets a minimum requirement of 50% renewable energy by 2030, and the campaign for carbon pricing, which would complement the Clean Energy Jobs Initiative by making clean energy even more competitive and driving down emissions across sectors. If elected, will you support these initiatives and commit to bringing our economy to the 21st century, cleaning up our air and protecting Marylanders from climate change by putting a price on carbon and investing in clean energy jobs?
I've already pushed to make sure that the state has increased its renewable portfolio standard. I helped lead the charge in us overturning Governor Hogan's veto this past year of the increase to the renewable portfolio standard. I support going to the 50%. It's going to be our step to get to 100%, because that is going to be what we need to move forward. And I think Alec's book even talks about some of those things that are going to happen to propel us forward. Now, when it comes to carbon pricing, I think that's a debate that we have to have. I think we have to look to see, there are a lot of details about that, how that works and how it interplays with our existing transportation funding approach. So I'm open to having that conversation and how it fits within Maryland's revenue structure, because that might be the appropriate way to go, but there are some other concerns that I think we have to look at before I can just blanketly say yes to that.
Yes, Mr. Baker, if chosen and elected, what would you do to change the Democratic Party? Since it's widely perceived that it is not so much that Hogan won, but the Democratic Party and the very nature of the Democratic Party is possibly obsolete in Maryland.
Well, I think by the election, I would have changed it a lot, given us the first time to elect an African-American as governor. But the thing that I want to change in the party that we should work for, just starting now, is to make the party more inclusive for everybody. That these issues that we care about, we just don't work on during a 4-year cycle, but we work on right now. And that's why a lot of us and many of the people here on the panel are working to make sure we get people actively involved in these issues that we care about starting today. Because we can't change what's going to happen in Annapolis in 2018 by waiting to 2018. We can't change what's going to happen in the United States by waiting to 2020. We've got to start working and reaching out now. And that's why a lot of us put a lot of effort into making sure the party is more inclusive
15 seconds.
and reaches out. And that's something we're going to start right now.
Next question.
Ms. Vignarajah, what will your administration do to make Maryland a more consumer-friendly state, including banking, competitive insurance, and regulations?
It's a great question. I think this is where Democrats do have an important job in terms of this election, because I do think Governor Hogan has labeled Maryland as open for business, but the truth is that we have a lot of regulatory redundancy and inefficiencies, and I think making sure that it is consumer-friendly requires a few things. One is the fact that small businesses are burdened, and I constantly hear this as I talk to folks about, well, this regulation shouldn't necessarily apply to me, but it does. And I think part of that is because we do have an overarching set of regulations that frankly, don't apply, but we're using kind of a broad brushstroke instead of, refining it to figure out what regulations actually need to apply. But I also think that making sure that business, the companies are open for business here also requires us to make sure that we are instituting policies that make sure that we are efficient, that we are not burdensome, because the truth is that many of the jobs that are, employing Marylanders are actually based on small businesses. And the reality is that while the governor has paid lip service to to us being a consumer-friendly and business-friendly state. The reality is
Your final thought?
This is for Senator Madaleno. As a cancer patient and a graduate of Harvard Law School, I have an interest in end-of-life option legislation as exists in the District of Columbia, California, and elsewhere. Would you support legislation allowing terminally ill patients to obtain a prescription for life-ending medication that they can then choose to use or not when the time for that decision comes?
Well, the best way for me to answer that question, since I'm already a sponsor of that legislation in the state Senate, is to say, as your governor, I would sign that bill. Because I think it's very important that people have that autonomy, that decision to make those very difficult choices. That's why the bill is called the compassionate choice legislation. I think we've worked very hard to come up with a sensible approach to it, and I think we should move forward with it. It is what other states are moving forward with, it's what DC has, it's what several European countries have, and I think it's important for us to have that conversation and to move forward with that in Maryland.
This question goes to Mr. Baker. The Washington area metro system is crucial in getting many residents to and from work and to maintaining our economy. Yet Metro is going down the drain for lack of dedicated funding. What should Maryland do in order to fund Metro going forward?
Well, one, I support that we do a dedicated funding for Metro. It needs to happen. And it requires that all jurisdictions participate, not just Maryland, but DC, Virginia, and the federal government. We're in discussions right now with the Metro Board to make that happen. But the way it's going to happen in Maryland and in Virginia is for the governor to say that this is a priority. And the reason it's a priority is because that's where we're going to create a job in the commercial taxes that will help us fund the projects in the state. But we've got to make it a priority with our funding. It means there are some great projects, roads and bridges that are in other parts of the state we're not going to be able to do. Or roads and bridges in Prince George's County. We have a lot of roads and bridges in our 500 square miles. But if we invest in the metro system, which is our job, it will help us. Same way in Baltimore City. I think you have to invest in the mass transit, and I would do it as governor.
This is a question for Mr. Ross. Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords left a vacuum in climate leadership that states like Maryland must fill. Governor Hogan has declined to join the U.S. Climate Alliance. However, many Marylanders see it as an important gesture of global solidarity in the face of a global challenge. If elected, will you commit to joining the U.S. Climate Alliance?
Yes, I absolutely will. I think that, a lot of people have this, that say these things like, oh, Larry Hogan, he's a nice guy. He's okay. He's moderate. But the very simple fact of the matter is that the Climate Alliance is a real statement of values, but beyond being a statement of values, its intent is to materially commit states to take actions where our deranged president is receding. And so I'm sorry, look, I get fired up about this because I was at the State Department during a lot of the negotiations for this, and for Trump to pull us out of this, and for Larry Hogan to then not join other states, saying because of the failure in Washington, we will step up in Maryland, to me demonstrates that his values on these issues contradict the values of most Marylanders on this. And this is why it does matter. One more example of why it matters that we get a Democrat back in Annapolis in the governor's seat in 2018.
This is a question for Mr. Shea. Maryland has already taken the important step of banning fracking in the state. To me, the next logical step would be to ban construction of new major natural gas infrastructure, such as the planned Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Potomac Pipeline. Where do you stand on this and other pipeline projects? If elected, would you be willing to pursue such a ban?
First of all, let me thank you for asking me a question. I wish you'd make it an easier one. It is an easy question. I absolutely would support the ban. Look, we only have one Chesapeake Bay. We only have those natural resources. They're really not ours. They're for our children. And if we can't invest in our children's future by giving them the natural resources that we've had. Shame on us.
This is a question for Krishanti. Maryland has 6 coal-fired power plants that are disrupting our climate and polluting our air. The 2013 MIT study indicated that Maryland has the highest per capita rate of death from air pollution in the country. And too many kids have asthma due to this pollution. What are your plans for transitioning rapidly from coal-generated electricity to improve our air quality and slow climate change?
It's a great question. So first, I think that part of this is absolutely about regulation, because while we are obviously coal dependent to some extent, we are 19th in terms of coal production of all the 50 states. So obviously, this is an integral part of our economy. The reality is we're not going to be able to shut down these coal plants, nor are we suggesting that immediately. But I also believe that in the interim, we absolutely need to have regulation, because there is absolutely no reason for why they should be endangering our children. But I also think that there is a bigger issue here, and it's twofold. One is the fact that some of the air pollution coming into Maryland is the result of neighboring states. Thankfully, the governor has finally kind of woken up to this fact, and we have Secretary Grumbles, who is now suing the EPA, because we know that this is a big concern and it is affecting Marylanders through and through. But I also think a bigger issue here is that we need to be transitioning to a clean energy economy, because we should be a pioneer on this across the eastern seaboard. And the truth is that whether it's offshore wind, whether it's solar energy, we're not quite there. And this is where, when Congressman Harris stands in the way, we should have a governor who says this is not what Maryland should be about. And unfortunately, we haven't had that leadership. We should be pioneers when it comes to all of these issues, because it's about our children, it's about the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries, it's about making sure that we all have a safe environment to live in.
This is for Mr. Madaleno. What is your position on a strong Maryland Trust Act? What would you want in it? And will you commit to engage the other candidates on this issue?
Right now?
Yep.
So, this past year, I was a co-sponsor of the Trust Act. I fought with my good friend Will Smith, who's still in the room, who's on the Judicial Proceedings Committee, to try to get it done. It should, at a minimum, send a signal to the immigrant communities that our police will not be nationalized, that our public safety agencies, whether the local police or the local correctional system or the state correctional system, we will not participate in unconstitutional seizures and unconstitutional holdings of individuals, that we have to stand up to ICE and say, look, if you're going to ask anyone else,
15 seconds.
Anyone else to come in and you want to hold someone for you to pick us up, you better have some charges and not just say it's a detainer and you want to go. And I was very proud, in fact, this past year, of getting a provision in the state budget that would allow Governor Hogan to backfill the loss of any state aid, any federal aid to a county or any public safety agency who has their federal money taken away by Jefferson Beauregard Sessions.
My question is for Mr. Shea. Do you think that Maryland's...
Microphone, please, use the mic.
Sorry. Do you think... Do you think that Maryland's congressional districts, as currently drawn, are a problem? If not, why not? And if yes, how would you change the process of drawing them after the next census?
Well, thank you. I'm going to roll now. It's my second question. The redistricting is an important issue everywhere, and Maryland's not excluded. We've done too much monkeying around with our districting. I don't have any specific point to make on any particular jurisdiction within our district within Maryland, but it's clearly increasing the polemic in this debate, where people have safe districts on the right and perhaps even safe districts on the left, and they're not listening, they're shouting at each other, and that's not good for American democracy. Now, as a Democrat and as a leader of the party, if I'm elected governor, I'm not going to give away the farm. I'm not going to say, fine, do with us what you will. We're going to have to work through a fair and logical way to have districts. When I was an assistant AG back in the early 80s, I handled the redistricting cases in Maryland, and there is law in this area. The districts have to be contiguous, they have to be compact, and they have to have due regard for natural boundaries and municipal boundaries. So there's law here to shape a fair districting, whether you're talking about state districts or the federal district.
Oh, okay, usually in my session, but often, it's one, I'll address Mr. Mello, since he's probably most familiar with this one. One of the President responsible goals is to establish a public banking system to help better manage the state budget following the North Dakota model. As governor, would you fight passionately and aggressively for this goal to succeed under your term?
So if people didn't catch the question, the state of North Dakota actually is the only state that has a state bank where they actually do have the ability to provide loans and guarantees for the people of North Dakota. I have worked with my colleague from District 18, Delegate Anasol Gutierrez, to try to move this forward for us to investigate whether or not that makes sense for the state of Maryland and how it would look, what it would look like, because it makes sense to have some sort of approach, and I don't know if we're going to call it necessarily a bank, but we need to make sure that we are out there providing assistance to our families, to small business people, to make sure they have access to capital, make sure that they have the ability to start businesses, to buy homes, to borrow money for college if need be, for other expenses.
15 seconds.
So there is a way for us to move forward to make sure that everyone has access to banking. North Dakota is different. It's really different than Maryland. So I think we do need to think about why they did it from a historical standpoint and what it might look like in our state. But I think that's one of the things that, with my experience at working on some of these issues, I would try to make progress.